Good evening, everyone, and good evening, Rachel, one more time. Thanks for being with us tonight. Before I start, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the current events unfolding in Turkey. As scholars and individuals, we are deeply affected and closely following the recent protests and developments. And this talk actually was planned and scheduled long before these events took place. And as it is held online, we have decided not to cancel it. However, we want to express our sincere respect and solidarity with all those who are directly impacted, and we share in the widespread concerns about the situation. We hope that our gathering today can also be a space for thoughtful engagement and intellectual reflection during these difficult times. And as always, we remain committed to critical thinking, public reason, and open dialogue, principles we believe are urgently needed today. And let me introduce our dear guest, Rachel Zuckert. It's an honor for us to host Professor Rachel Zuckert this evening session. Professor Zuckert is a distinguished scholar of Kant and professor of philosophy at Northwestern University. Her research explores a wide range of topics in Kant's theoretical and practical philosophy, with a special focus on aesthetics, teleology, and the philosophy of biology. She's perhaps best known for her groundbreaking book, Kant on Beauty and Biology, an interpretation of the Critique of Judgment, which offers a unified reading of the third critique and has become essential reading for anyone working in this field. In addition to this major work, she is the co-editor of Kant's Observation and Remarks, a critical guide, and has published extensively in leading journals on issues such as the role of purposiveness in Kant's biology of nature and the nature of aesthetic judgment, and the relationship between Kant's philosophy of nature and his moral philosophy. Her most recent work continues to probe Kant's understanding of living beings, the limits of mechanistic explanation, and the broader implications of teleology in modern thought. Through her scholarship, she has played a central role in reshaping how we understand the third critique, not as a marginal or supplementary text, but as a key to understand Kant's broader philosophical project. Zuckert is also a former president of North American Kant Society. Lastly, I would like to remind that the talk will be recorded and will be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So we are delighted to have her here with us today as the sixth of our ongoing talk series, Kant and the Needs of Reason. So please join me welcoming Professor Rachel Zuckert. Thank you. Floor is yours, Rachel.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And it's an honor, of course, to be invited and to have the opportunity to discuss this work, which is it's still very much in progress. I do think it would be more appropriate for both you and our current situation to be talking about Kant's political thought, which is more relevant than ever. But that's not really what I work on, so I apologize for that. So I'll just leap in, and if I speak too quickly, please try I can see some people that try to wave or something, and I'll slow down. I have a tendency in that direction. Okay, so I want to start just by this isn't really an introduction, but by talking a little bit about my sort of broader motivation in the project in general. And this is not usual for me, but it's slightly polemical or anyway, directed against this recent interpretive tendency. So I call this a neo-Aristotelian way of thinking about Kant. And by that, I mean that scholars claim, I give you some examples, Kant sees reason and human cognitive faculties in general as having an assigned natural purpose. So they have a proper purpose that is assigned by their nature. Their functioning is directed naturally toward that purpose, and that purpose sets the standard for their correct or successful functioning. So that's a kind of common approach these days. It does have interpretive textual support in especially these two passages that I put on the slide. I'm not going to read them, but just in sum up, in the appendix of the dialectic, Kant says that every one of our natural powers, he says, has purpose. And so reason, it looks like reason doesn't have a purpose, doesn't have a correct use because it tries to do transcendent metaphysics and it fails, but it's a natural power. And so it in fact does. And now let's look for it. Similarly, and I think even more explicitly in the groundwork, Kant has an extensive discussion. I just quote a little bit of it here, in which he says, all natural faculties have ends as natural faculties. Reason also. Reason is bad at promoting happiness, so it must have some other end. Oh, it's morality. Okay, so there are these textual passages that look like Kant is talking about reason as having a natural end. That said, I just don't think this is right about Kant. So in general, I think it's not right because Kant is an anti-realist about natural purposes. Sorry, I should have put on the slide natural purposes in the critique of judgment. So I don't think he's an anti-realist about purposes, not reasons purposes. So there, as I'm sure you know, Kant understands natural purposes to be such, only on analogy to reason's purpose. So we understand reason's purposes, and then we kind of judge nature as if like that. So I think this Aristotelian approach in which you say, oh, there's natural purposes, and so we'll explain reason's purposes this way, gets things backwards for Kant. So that's the first. And the second is a kind of more general feeling about what reason is like in Kant, namely that reason is not just fitting some place that we have in the world and finding that and directing us towards it or something, but rather, as Kant puts it, in this one of my favorite descriptions, reason is restless on Kant's view. So I take it pushes us beyond ourselves. It asks us to transform ourselves. It's revolutionary and so forth. And I'm naming that aspect of reason aspirational. Okay, so that's kind of the general, or one of my general issues here. Of course, those are really big claims. I'm not going to talk about all of them today. I'm just going to first give an account of what I think or what I mean by aspiration. Then I will give a sort of brief account of how reason is aspirational according to that little picture of what aspiration is. And then I would like to turn to paragraph 76 and 77 as really part of thinking, as a support for this way of thinking about reason that I want to propose. And I guess as one step into thinking about how should we think about the purposes of reason in light of the critique of judgment, treatment of purposes. Okay, so off we go. Oh yeah, I should say, so my agenda with 76, 77 is the intuitive intellect, if there were one. The intuitive intellect is the one for whom reason's purposes would be constitutive or naturally set. Our nature is different. So for our nature, it is not within our nature. So I hope that will be clear as we go on. All right, so first, aspiration. So here I just mean to use a relatively normal everyday meaning of aspiration, namely a human attitude or orientation that usually has to do with action. So you envision something that you want to do or to be, usually to improve yourself or achieve something. And in light of that vision, you try to do that. So aspiration is similar, I think, to striving, another common way of talking in the post-Kantian tradition, especially, but I think has less emphasis on work. Striving has this kind of effortfulness to it, and more emphasis on self-improvement, self-transformation, going beyond where one currently is. So then as you see, I analyze this concept as having several separate elements that are important for me. First, aspiration is fundamentally teleological, or in Kant's terms, of course, purposive. That is, aspiration is end-directed. It aims at something, you could say. And second, it does so consciously. That is, when one aspires to something, one is conscious of having that as a goal and doesn't realize this unconsciously or just sort of as a matter of course. Moreover, the third, this goal is, as I mentioned, in some way transformative, pointing you beyond where you are, as different from what you currently are, getting to be on a new level. Sometimes we say something like that about aspiration. So all of this, just to pause for a second, means that, this is part of my sort of agenda here, means that aspiration is a kind of teleology that is non-Aristotelian. That is, it is not the idea that one has a natural potential that could be sort of sparked by circumstances and mature without consciousness of it. I take it that's part of the Aristotelian, we have a natural constitutive purpose and that could just kind of develop of itself. So aspiration's not like that, it's conscious. And again, Aristotelian teleology is in principle not transformative. You have your nature. You may change and develop that nature or come to have it in a fuller way or something, but you're not fundamentally transforming yourself with Aristotelian teleology. So then fourth, aspiration is, given 1 to 3, aspiration is somewhat puzzling. That is because the agent on the one side has to envision the goal, like has to be conscious. Here's what my goal is, here's what I'm aspiring to do. But on the other side, that goal has to be beyond her. She doesn't fully get it. It's not fully who she is yet, etc. So both conscious of it, but also not quite fully. So I use this language of, it's very clunky, directive framework to talk about what that goal will look like. So here's my idea with that. On the one side, the agent does direct her activity in accord with this idea of a goal, so it directs, but it's just a framework, it's sketchy, it's incomplete, and only will be sort of fully understood once one achieves the transformation, like really has become in this way better. So I inspired partially, I don't list Laurie Paul, but I'm inspired partially in this concept by Agnes Callard's treatment, which is, I do have on the slide, and also Laurie Paul talks about in contemporary philosophy. And they then have this debate, are discussing the question, is aspiration even rational? How can you aim at something that you don't really understand what it is? So they're worried about that concern. My agenda, it may still be irrational, but my agenda is the opposite to almost, which is to say that for Kant, reason itself is aspirational. So what it is fully to be rational is also to be aspirational for Kant. And in fact, I want to say reason's goals are permanently aspirational. That is, they are always beyond us. They are never fully achieved. We never fully fill out the ideas of reason. They're always directive frameworks in my language. So anyway, so that's what I would like to say about reason. And I'm now going to turn in Kant, and I'm now going to turn to talk about how we might think that it goes. Why I think so about Kant. Oh, why am I not? Oh yeah, okay, here we go. Part two. So first I just note there are some ways in which Kant talks about reason that do sound aspirational. So one way is, as in the title of your speaker series, Kant, of course, talks about the needs of reason, interests of reason, things like this, almost sounding like reason. It has these unfulfilled longings or something. So these ways Kant has of talking about reason, which are unusual, also characterize reason as teleological and sort of aiming at something almost beyond it. And then specifically, I give you two passages. Again, I'm not going to read these, but two instances about, again, theoretical on the one side and practical reason on the other, where it looks like Kant is, again, describing reason as proposing goals that are held out as kind of beyond us. So on the one side, Kant says in this famous passage, theoretical reason gives us ideas that serve as a focus imaginarius for empirical scientific investigation. And that looks like it sets goals that are beyond us, that investigation kind of tries but fails in a way to reach. They're imaginary, they're an imaginary focus. And similarly, Kant, of course, thinks that practical reason sets goals or ends, namely virtue, the perfect republic, the highest good, happiness, universal happiness in proportion to morality. And it looks like those are never, on Kant's view, never fully achieved, but always to be striven for. So as I say, I give you one quotation to this effect about virtue. So there's some initial textual evidence for thinking that Kant is thinking this way. And now I'll just walk through then these characterizations of aspiration and talk about how I think they apply to reason on Kant's view. So first about teleology, of course, reason is, as I mentioned, paradigmatic of teleology for Kant. So Kant defines a purpose, and this is on the slide, as, quote, the concept of an object insofar as it is at the same time the ground of the reality of that object, and purposiveness is the causality of a concept with regard to its object. So what a purpose is for Kant is the aim of an intentional, intelligent agent or activity. It just is a concept that describes an object that the agent is going to bring about. So all purposes, including those of reason, are conscious for Kant. That is, they are conceptualized. Correlatively, I want to say for Kant, jumping forwards to point 3a, purposes just aren't natural potentials that are then realized or unfolded in the Aristotelian way. Instead, as I said, purposes are concepts that guide action and then serve as standards by which the product of that action is judged. So as I'm sure you all know, in the critique of judgment, Kant will refer to, is the object what it was meant to be? And there it is what the agent intended to bring about through that action. That's kind of that language. So I should say, of course, the agent can think of concepts because based on experience of nature. So you might see a cave and then form a concept of a hut that you could build, based on that experience of something natural. But by conceptualizing it and making it into an intention of action, the agent makes that natural thing into a purpose. Before it was just this thing that was sitting there. So, correlatively, as I mentioned, when Kant talks about natural purposes or our temptation to talk about natural purposes, he pervasively treats those things as analogous to, judged as if they are, etc., proper purposiveness, and that is by which he means intelligent, intentional activity. So all of that is to say, I think for Kant, purposes are non-Aristotelian. And I think his account also leaves open the possibility that it's not just that, purposes sort of add to nature or something by conceptualizing it, but rather one could have purposes that are generated entirely by the intellect that don't come from nature at all. And Kant calls those purposes autonomy. That is, reason comes up with its own ends for action, and sets them sort of developing out of its own activity. All right, so all of this is to say that intelligent intentional activity, such as the cognitive activity of theoretical reason or the productive activity guided by concepts of practical reason, are purposive, teleological, and they're in fact paradigmatically so for Kant. Now to turn more explicitly to the third and fourth points. So here I want to say that reason's autonomous end setting specifically is a subset of purposive activities, and it is the aspirational subset of purposive activities. That is, ones that enjoin us to transform ourselves or transcend ourselves, and where we are guided by directive frameworks in my terminology. So here what I want to do is make a distinction Kant himself does not make explicitly between two ways or two kinds of concepts that could be the concept of the object, such that the concept is the cause of the product of the activity. That is, two kinds of concepts that could be the purposes of action. Because Kant actually uses concept in two ways. One is the genus way of saying any thought representation is a concept. So that's this general way of talking about concepts. Then, of course, there is the concepts of the understanding, which are specific kind of thought representation, and ideas of reason, and Kant, which is also a thought representation. And Kant also refers to these as concepts of reason. But of course, concepts of the understanding, concepts of reason are quite different. And I want to say they guide purposive activity differently or function differently as purposes. So a reminder, I'm sure you all know this. So concepts of the understanding are for Kant rules of classification, of determination, of synthesis in cognitive activities. They allow us to represent sensibly given particulars as grouped, determined, connected, and so as unified into objects or more broadly objective experience. As a result, concepts of the understanding are instantiable in experience precisely because they serve as these intellectual form or links necessary for ordering sensible experience. So, concepts. By contrast, Kant says many, many times, I give you a short version from the Anthropology, ideas of reason are representations, quote, to which no object given in experience can be adequate. And the reason why those ideas cannot be instantiated in experience is the kind of object that they represent, namely unconditioned entities or totalities. So, as you all know, I'm sure Kant takes reason, it went understood narrowly, to seek the unconditioned, as he says, for the unifying or conditioning relations that attributed to objects by the understanding, temporal priority, cause and effect, and so forth. Reason, you could say, aims to get at a secure resting point or ultimate point in that search for conditions, whether it is the highest universality or a first necessary ground. And in doing that, it forms ideas of what that ultimate necessary ground might be, namely simple substances, infinite causal chain, ens realissimum or God, and so forth. But that kind of thing is not instantiable in experience because we do not experience a complete totality of all objects, nor necessarily existing objects, and so forth. Similarly, in the practical sphere, reason formulates ideas like the highest good or virtue and so forth, which are standards of goodness beyond what we have ever experienced and are never fully instantiated in any particular action. So that's the distinction between concepts and ideas. And then I'd like to say, because of the difference between these two, they function as two different kinds of purposes for action, or of two different kinds of activity. So on the one side, I'd like to say, and again, Kant himself does not say this, that, but I think it follows reasonably straightforwardly from his commitments, that concepts of the understanding narrowly guide technic, what he calls technic or mechanical activity. So the concepts serve as rules. They, provide a checklist or procedure of what you should do in what order to produce what, and then in turn as standards of success about whether what you produced really lives up to what you were aiming to make. And here, I think, though, of course, you can, plan badly or not succeed at doing what you're aiming to do. Like, all those things can happen. You can fail, but there's nothing in principle beyond the agent in that kind of activity. By contrast, an activity guided by ideas as purposes would be aspirational in the sense of beyond the agent, because ideas are not rules of synthesis of the sensible manifold, and so they can't directly govern the production of empirical objects. And likewise, no empirical object is going to be adequate according to their standard. It will not be the high unconditional good or whatever. So in that sense, they direct our activity beyond ourselves, beyond our actual sphere of activity, namely within experience. And again, I would just say on my anti-Aristotelian agenda, this is another reason to think that reason is not particularly Aristotelian, because it's just going outside of nature altogether. Okay, so on the one side, ideas direct us to try to attain something that is beyond our sphere of activity. So that's about the object. On the other side, I think ideas provide us only directive frameworks. So this is on the side of the subject, how the subject understands what the subject is doing. So ideas have what I would call sketchy content. That is, they're not spelled out, they aren't rules, they aren't exemplifiable, they don't give you a checklist, and so forth. Instead, they are kind of counterfactual descriptions of kind of what it would be good to know about, how it would be good to know that. So it would be great if we could grasp infinity or know the totality or whatever. All those things would be great, but we don't, in fact, know those things. So, for example, and I think this is the paradigm of ideas for Kant, the idea of God as the ens realissimum is the being that has all realities, but Kant is quite clear, but we don't know what those realities are. So that's a very sketchy idea, all realities, but who knows which ones they are. And so as a result, they guide activity, they do direct activity, but only in this sketchy framework way. So yeah, so I would say there that, instead of providing kind of a checklist, they provide a sort of direction, a target, something to emulate. You can try to get closer to that in aspiration, but not, sort of check off list by list, I now have done it. And as you get closer, maybe you might fill in its sketchy content slightly more. All right, so all this is to say that I propose ideas of reason provide permanently and intrinsically aspirational goals, prodding us beyond where we are, wherever it is we are, and never to be satisfied with that. And so aspiration also includes within it another of Kant's famous characterizations of reason, namely self-criticism, right? We always fall short of this standard that reason sets. Okay, so now on to paragraph 76 to 77. And I should say actually two excusatory things. I'm hardly talking about 77 at all. So it's mostly 76. And I'm only saying one little small thing about about them. Very puzzling paragraphs. So I will remind you, these are paragraphs that are placed within Kant's resolution of the antinomy of teleological judgment, which is the purported conflict between principles of natural mechanism and of teleology in the case of judging organisms. And Kant claims in broad strokes that this conflict arises because of the specific and limited character of human cognition. And so Kant seems to sort of conclude, and we don't need to worry about this conflict. There are just two ways that we have of judging things. It's not a contradiction in the nature of things. And in fact, the true ultimate character of reality may unite these two ways of behaving in ways that we don't really understand. So overall, then, you could say, too, that this discussion is part of Kant's project of critique, namely recognizing the limits of human cognitive claims. So don't worry about this conflict that is only about us, but also I think Kant is trying to head off any thoughts that we could infer that God exists as the cause, the purposive designer of the organisms and so forth. That also, all of this thing about purposiveness, just our way of thinking, and doesn't entail any truths about things. Okay, so that sort of overview of what Kant's up to in the dialectic of teleological judgment. And, what have I done here? Okay, sorry. He's also talking about that in 76 to 77. But in 76 to 77, they're sort of special in that Kant is making those remarks about this is restricted to human cognition by contrast to another kind of intellect, namely the intuitive intellect, that does not have these limitations that we do. So in 76, especially, Kant talks about this conflict. You see, I've listed it as the third point here. Kant talks about this conflict as the third example among three of a limit to human cognition, or you might say human. I put human limitations in general because the second one is about the will and not about cognition. So now I will remind you about what these three are. These three examples. So the first is, Kant reminds us that we are discursive intellects, and as a result, our concepts characterize only mere possibility. That is merely a way something could be, or a way it could be understood by us. And they do not posit, in his language, by themselves an actually existing particular entity. That the existence of something is presented to us by sensible intuition. So for us, there is a gap between conceptual intelligibility, concepts, and so forth as mere possibility, and being or actuality. Second, very familiar view of Kant's, because we are finite rational beings, the moral law presents itself to us as an imperative. That is, it doesn't just automatically always govern how we act. We can will according to it, but we also always could succumb to sensible inclinations or selfish interests. And so the moral law presents itself to us as a command. Don't do that other thing. Finally, third, the antinomy of teleological judgment is also described as a consequence of discursivity of the intellect. That is, that concepts do not describe everything about sensible particulars, so a different consequence of discursivity. Instead, concepts just pick out certain aspects of objects and not others, and leave a lot else undetermined or contingent. As a result, Kant says we have to apply concepts to sensibly given particulars, but we also have to look at particulars to come up with further concepts that might apply to them. And in the case of organisms, we need two conflicting principles that would guide us in doing these two different forms of tasks of judgment, Kant says. So that's where the conflict arises. Let me see if I can do this. There we go. So those are the three examples. And as I mentioned, in each example, Kant is contrasting the human case, what we do, with the case of the intuitive intellect. So by contrast to us, that intellect would grasp at once intellectually and intuitively everything about an entity as fully determinate, fully intelligible, and actual, without any remainder of particularity or contingency that calls for judgment. So that's the official contrast. But I think in the second example, though Kant does not explicitly refer to God as a holy will, this is an implicit contrast case in the second example. So there he is implicitly contrasting our will, which, for which the moral law is an imperative, with the holy will that by its very nature always and ineliminably acts in accord with the moral law. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's like a lot going on in these paragraphs, and I'm not gonna talk about it all. I really am talking about one thing about them, which is convenient for my agenda. So, and that is that I think in each of these three cases, well, in effect, what Kant does is say that the intuitive intellect aims at an end and accomplishes that end that is set by human reason. So the ends of human reason are characterized by Kant as beyond us. They belong to, in effect, to the nature of another kind of being, that is the intuitive intellect. So, and they constitute that, it's better than us, and so forth. They are an object of aspiration. So I'm now going to walk through the three cases just to sort of try to substantiate this claim. I'm having such a hard time. There we go. Okay, to try to substantiate this claim about this functioning of these examples. So I think the moral case, the second case, is the clearest instance of this kind of structure. So obviously, practical reason sets an end for human beings, for human action, namely virtue. And as Kant says about it, very aspirational sounding, and this is the first quotation on the left side of the slide, virtue is always in progress, because considered objectively, it is an ideal, while yet constant approximation to it is a duty, unquote. And then similarly, in a much longer quotation, I won't read all of it, on the right-hand side of the slide, in 76, he talks about the idea of an intelligible world where everything would be actual merely because it is, as something good, possible. And he also says that's the world in which practical reason without sensibility would operate as a cause. So that's the kind of idea of virtue, what virtue would be, the end that reason sets for us. And then he says, but given our constitution as partially sensible natures, this idea is a, quote, regulative principle for ourselves and for every being that has a connection to the sensible world. And again, this is by contrast, as I said a minute ago, to the divine will, where, and this is the second quotation on the left of the slide, from the groundwork, where the ought, that is the imperative, is out of place here because volition is of itself in accord with the law. That is to say, for the holy will, the moral law is a constitutive principle by its very nature, whereas for us, virtue is an aspiration going beyond what our nature is, not constitutive, but calling upon us to transform ourselves. Okay, so then I wanted to say that actually the third example is, there are some complications here we could talk about, but the third example is similar. So here, this is the antony of teleological judgment. Here, Kant identifies an end also that is set by reason, namely the articulation of a complete system of natural laws. And that would make it the case that all that presents itself to us as contingent, in fact, can be explained as law-governed and necessary according to this complete system with all specific empirical laws. Okay, so what I want to say about that, again, on parallel to virtue, is that here we have an epistemic goal that is asking us to leave the state that is natural to us. That is, the state that is natural to us is one in which, as discursive intellects, some aspects of particulars are contingent for us, whereas others are ruled by laws. But here we're aiming at a case in which everything would be ruled by laws. And that is the situation of the intuitive intellect, which judges, Kant says, by synthetic, this is my one moment of paragraph 77, synthetic universals, where you know the whole before the parts, and so everything about the parts is determined. There is nothing contingent. Okay, so our system of laws would bring us close to get us into the position of the intuitive intellect, or that is to have a nature different than the one we in fact have. Okay, and then finally, his first example about possibility and actuality is tougher to fit into this pattern. And I think it's more going on there that has to do with critique and just sort of making it clear that possibility and actuality are really only about us. It's not obvious to me why Kant really wants to emphasize this here in the third critique, but nonetheless, it does, though, have this moment, which is very similar to the structure that I want to be emphasizing. Namely, and you see this on the slide, he refers to, quote, the demand of reason to assume some sort of thing, the original ground, as existing absolutely necessarily, in which possibility and actuality can no longer be distinguished at all. And he says this is a concept of reason that our understanding cannot make itself equal to that concept. In fact, he says something like it's not really thinkable by the understanding. So I think here we can understand Kant as saying reason sets the standard for what would count as finally truly satisfactory knowledge. That is, where on the one side, concepts are not just sort of conditionally possibly related to the actual. That is, that maybe things are to be understood this way. There's no question there. And then on the other side, where all actual objects would be completely and totally intelligible. So there would be no actuality that was separate from, potentially distinct from intelligibility. So I think this standard, I suggest, is again, this demand of reason, this aim is marked as outside of our nature, right? This is something that belongs, again, to the intuitive intellect, for which, as he says, for an intuitive intellect, there would be no objects apart from what is actual. This distinction between possibility and actuality would collapse. By contrast, for us, this idea functions as a regulative principle. And I think in the first instance, it's functioning as a regulative principle in prompting us to set the end of the complete system of science, which would be our best shot at getting this kind of knowledge. And of course, that's beyond what our understanding just sort of naturally, automatically, normally is doing, namely just applying concepts to particulars where there is a good amount left in the actuality or contingency of the particular that's undetermined by the concept. Okay, so all of that is to say, to sum up now, in each of those examples, Kant identifies an end that is set by human reason, and he characterizes that end as constitutive of or natural to a different kind of intellect, not our intellect, not our nature. Instead, this end of reason directs us outside and beyond our nature. And I want to say, if, Kant doesn't put it this way, but, again, with my anti-Aristotelian agenda, one could say, if one wanted, these ends are the natural ends of this other kind of intellect, not our intellect, because for that intellect, its concepts create the objects in question. So its concepts create the objects of knowledge, its concepts create the good, and so forth in an automatic way, there's no striving or, beyondness or needing to bring it about or whatever, but that's not intrinsic to the just definition of purpose that for Kant, but of aspiration as I'm talking about it. Okay, so of course, I should say, not that this is a surprise, we are not acquainted with this kind of intellect. We don't know that it exists. We don't know what its natural purposes are. Our idea of it is also an idea of reason. And what I'm suggesting is that it is an idea of the kind of being that could fully accomplish the ends of reason, of our reason, but a different kind of being than us, in fact. And I guess here I wanted to say a little bit something about the way in which I think, Kant doesn't mention God by name, but there are all these in paragraph 76 to 77, but there are all these kind of rules of God that have not been sort of fully integrated by Kant here. So God is the object, this perfect, if you could know an object where possibility and actuality were collapsed, that is, that it exists from its very concept, that would be knowing God exists by the ontological proof. Of course, it doesn't work for us. We can't do it. So God is the object of such perfect knowledge. God is also obviously thought of by Kant as the knower of that perfect knowledge. And God obviously also is the holy will, or thought to be the holy will. And I think, is thought of as the cause of nature or the designer of organisms and so forth. So we have all of these kind of gestural roles for the concept of God to play. I'm not saying they're inconsistent, but I think that what that points us to is the fact that this is an idea that is what I'm calling a directive framework. That is, these are just gestures. It's just a very abstract way of talking about look at this alternative possibility that we can't fully understand, but would be better than where we are, in fact, ourselves. Okay, so in conclusion then, I have proposed that for Kant, reason is aspirational and is intrinsically or ineliminably so. That is, it directs us consciously towards ends that enjoin transformation or self-transcendence, and those ends are therefore understood only sketchily or as targets of striving. Those ends are not internal to our own nature. They are not constitutive of us. They are not our essences, etc., but rather they are autonomously articulated through reason's own activity. And so I end with this, this of course opens this whole question, which is a big question, which is how does reason do that? And that is a topic for some other time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. That's really interesting and a little bit really challenging, because I think this recently we are really exposed in Kant's scholarship that's concepts of ends of reason, purposes of reason, and they're really taken to be a kind of constitutive, as you seem to put your position, as opposed to. Actually, normally, thank you. I really learned a lot, and it was really mind-opening and triggering. Thank you. Normally, I let the space for the audience to ask the question, but I will make a, then, and I would like to start with my question. Feel like I am kind of frozen at times. Can you hear me right now?
I'm sorry, it just blanked out for a minute. It has been okay, but I miss your question.
Okay,
Please
great.
say your question again.
No, great. I didn't ask the question yet, but I felt like I was about to throw. So here is the question. Okay, my question is initially is referring to the distinction that you kept between the theoretical and practical spheres. It seemed to make a kind of playing a role in the sense that they both are aspirational, and I feel like I can follow your position in the theoretical reason more closely, and I found that yes, in the theoretical reason we have discursive intellect, and we are in a sense imperfect, not intuitive. So I could make more sense of that, how it becomes aspirational for us to have the yearn for a perfect knowledge, perfect complete science, which is just aspirational. But when it comes to practical reason, I felt like this reading may have a harder time to fit in the Kant's textual evidence, because when it comes to practical sphere, I feel like because you at some point said that aspirational meant that it is beyond the agent, it is transformative, and it felt like it is a kind of semi-evolutionary, that we are as the imperfect agents are likely. But in the practical sphere, isn't it the case that when we talk about reason and we are talking about moral law, we are talking about Wille, not Willkür itself. And when it comes to Wille, it somehow overlaps the reason, the practical reason, with a capital letter itself, not the limited agent that has these limitations and that has weaknesses, etc. So I felt like in the practical sphere, we become kind of godlike when we try to be virtuous, that we try to overlap with a possible holy will. So therefore, if we consider in the practical sphere, reason is a kind of aspirational, I don't feel like it challenges the idea that also it is constitutive of the practical reason. We, in a sense, partake in, or we have instantiation of this practical reason with a capital letter, that is the moral law in us, which is not my limited willkür, but what is the I have partake of that. That is, I'm not fully this, but I have my share of it. So feels like it is a kind of constitutive rather than I voluntarily try to comply with or have my sometimes involve in my actions. This will be my mere willkür use rather than Wille or the practical reason itself.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'll have to think about the way of thinking about this in terms of Villa and Vilcour, since I take your point. I just hadn't been thinking of it exactly in those terms. Let's see if I come up with something, but I may have to think more about that. So just to restate in my terms, I do think that I have a practical reason problem of two kinds. So on the one side, I think you're absolutely right that Kant presents practical reason as in some way successful in the way that theoretical reason is not. So then you could say, so Rachel, it's not aspirational, it actually is successful. So on the one side, that is a problem. And then I would say also, though, I need to say something about if it is aspirational, why is it nonetheless a little bit more successful version of aspirational than somehow theoretical reason is? So yeah. So I guess here's what I kind of want to say, but I'm not like, well, I want to say two things, but I'm not, do they work? I don't know. Well, actually, first, this is what I will say. First, what is true, so Kant does think practical reason is more successful, and he does think that somehow, I think maybe we can know through practical reason that particular actions are right. So I think in the way that we can never know about, the immortal soul or something like that. That said, he also always describes virtue as that's an end that practical reason sets us, and that is always beyond us. So he always describes it in that way. And I think the highest good is more complicated, but I think one could say the same about the highest good, partially because it includes virtue. So you do have this kind of, just in the text and the way Kant's describing it, this aspirational element, which maybe is the Vilcore. So then I guess what I want to say is this, that that practical reason, like fundamentally what it is supposed to do is not just articulate what the good is, which I think is what Kant thinks it manages to do, not just do that, but actually realize itself in, like, make things that way. So partially make the world good, like set up the perfect republic, but also make me fully good, make me fully virtuous. And so I think that's what the demand of practical reason really is. And that demand is the realization of virtue. And that is what we never end up fully doing. So I guess now I'm talking myself around to saying, though we participate in Villa, as you said, what Villa is for us is carrying itself out in Vilcourt, if one wants to put it that way. And so it's incomplete if it's just saying what the good is. No, it has to make me good. And that is what is not fully achieved. Bang.
Okay, thank you. And I have Rosamund. Rosamund, please go ahead. Yeah, can you please, unmute yourself? I am Rosamund. Yeah, thank you. We cannot still hear you. Can you check your microphone? You also don't hear her, right? It's not only me. If you want, you can type your question on the chat, because even you unmuted yourself, we were unable to hear you. Would you like to type your question on chat? Great. And meanwhile, if we have other questions while she's typing. Okay, while she's typing, maybe I can jump in and Saniye, please go ahead. You have your question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, thank you. So I have actually two questions. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Although initially I was very sympathetic, I have some questions for clarification, actually. First of all, I am worried that portraying Aristotle in the way that you portrayed here could be a little bit unfair to the neo-Aristotelian interpretations, because it seems like Aristotle's purposes are also aspirational in one sense, and transformative and transcendent even sometimes, in the sense that, for example, a completely virtuous person is kind of an ideal case and may not be fully achieved by any individual human being, right? Eudaimonia is never fully attained by any human, and it seems like Aristotle acknowledges that. So in that respect, it's kind of transcendent and yet at the same time constitutive of our nature. And this brings me, and the reason why is that because it's not constitutive of any particular individual human agent, but constitutive of the human species, right? That is the nature of the human species, but not nature of me individually. And so in that respect, it seems like Aristotelian telos or purposes are constitutive of the species of the things rather than maybe individual things. And so if we think of Kantian reason as a species of faculty, and that even though you want to kind of separate and show the differences between human reason and holy will and God, it seems like both God and humans are rational. And in fact, we are members of the same community of rational beings. So in that respect, it seems like if reason, I think this kind of is related to Seniye's question, if reason is this end-setting faculty, and we have that, and God has it in maybe incomplete and finite version, its telos must be, the teloses that it sets for us must be the teloses that is constitutive of reason, not constitutive of Seniye's reason, but constitutive of this finite reason, or versus the constitutive of the, God's telos is, maybe determined by God's infinite reason. But still, this activity of reason, going back to your maybe final claim that the telos of the reason is determined by its activity, then the question is, what is this activity is determined by if it's not by reason's nature, right? Is it determined arbitrarily? Is it determined by something that is superior? If it's determined by God, then we lose autonomy. But if it's determined by its nature, then we have autonomy. And then we can say, look, human reason as a finite form of this rational faculty is able to determine its telos, and this telos, even though it's kind of never realized in this world by any particular agent, is still constitutive of this our rational nature. So that would be maybe a comeback from the Aristotelian interpreters. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. This is great. As I said, I knew that I had this practical reason problem, but now you guys are telling me all these further ways in which I have a practical reason problem. So let's see. I guess the first thing I would say is that I certainly don't mean to be giving any kind of interpretation of Aristotle. So Aristotle may think a lot of things, and I don't want to commit to that, being accurate about Aristotle at all. What's important for me is the idea that there could be, which I think is in Aristotle, that there could be this natural purpose kind of there, just like sitting there without the cognitive activity generating or thinking of the purpose and setting it as a purpose. So I think Aristotle thinks that it is there. It's just like in the structure of things. So I think that is accurate about Aristotle. And that's only that is what I then want to resist as a way of thinking about Kantian purposes, that just in the structure of what reason is, there is this end. And I completely agree with you that the neo-Aristotelian readers of Kant want to say that end would then be our species end. It would not be just like my own particular or your own particular end, but one set by the species or by our nature. So yes, and if I suggested otherwise, which it may well have, that was my bad. So I guess here. then the question is, why do I, as you are asking, why do I want to say that that end, which belongs to us by all of us as a species, is not in our nature or constitutive of our nature? So, I mean, one thing there to say is that, and this is why 76 is so convenient for me, I think, is that in 76, the presentation is like, this really is the nature of something. These ends belong to a different nature by species, right? Like God is a different nature from us. So I mean, you know, may or may not exist, etc. But sort of in principle, being a discursive intellect is our common nature, all of us. So if this end is beyond that nature, then it's beyond all of us as a species. So that's my kind of textual interest. I do think that practical reason is more complicated than the discursive understanding case. So that's one thing to say. And then the other thing to say is, so I think this is kind of fine-grained, but this is what I want to say is like, yes, reason has its way of operating. It does things, and that is by nature. So specifically, reason engages in syllogistic thinking. And that's what reason does. So theoretically, and also, I'm trying to learn about the practical reason case. Also, practical reason operates syllogistically from principles down to particular actions. So that's what reason does. And then what I want to say is, given that fact, we then, out of that syllogistic reasoning, think of what would be the outcome that we would want that would satisfy that activity. But that thought is sort of from within, engaging in the activity. What does the activity lead you to think would be good? But it is not what is there within the structure of that activity. No, it's not preset in the structure of that activity. And in fact, I mean, a way I think is interesting about both of those early quotations that I have on the first slide, is that both those quotations suggest that if we just let the functioning go towards its natural, like where it will naturally end up, it ends up with error. So reason needs to really think through carefully, what does it actually want and what can it actually accomplish? And that is the right end, not this other thing that it might sort of willy-nilly end up doing. So that's that. But as I say, I don't want to deny that reason does things, but I want to say it doesn't have ends, that it sets its own ends through actually engaging in the activity rather than just having them there.
Can I just, yeah, so I think the reason why I assumed that you must be talking about the individuals, because the activity happens in the individuals, right? So the activity of reason happens in the individual human beings, and it seems like then we are, as we are engaging in rational activity, individually setting ends, and then, well, arbitrarily or somehow given to us by God. So I'm basically, this was a question of clarification. So what is this alternative really? So I, as a rational agent doing rational activity, either practical and theoretical, am I setting the end arbitrarily, if not guided by reason's own nature, or then is it given to me by God? It seems like both options are then problematic. And the first critique, Kant's first critique, passages about the connection between human reason and God, that God is the forebuilt and the original archetypal image of reason, and we are the nachbild, we are the copy of reason. So that kind of close connection between, you know, perfect reason and finite reason, infinite reason and finite reason, seems to kind of go against maybe a little bit your reading that we are completely different, and then, you know, we need this kind of our end setting is not happening within us, is not constitutive in our nature, but is somehow transcendent. So there are these passages where he, you know, acknowledges the differences, but there are also passages where he wants to, you know, connect us to God.
Sani, may I interrupt a little bit kindly, because we have other questions waiting on the chat. Thank you so much. Rachel, do you want to add anything more to what Sani has just said? Or I'd like to read the waiting questions. Sorry to interrupt.
I will just say one thing, which is the archetype discussion is hard. I'm not sure what to make of it. But one could say that we rationally, creatively come up with the idea of the archetype, and then we take ourselves to be archetypes of it, and that whole thing is what reason does aspirationally. So that's kind of the direction I would want to go, but I don't guarantee that I can make fully sense of that passage, which is hard.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have 3 questions on the chat. I think 2 kind of similar. So I would like to start with the last one, which was actually addressed first by Rosamine. I will read her question on chat. Everybody can read me as well, if you wish. Rosamine, would you like to try one more time if your microphone is functioning, so we could hear your voice rather than hearing mine one more time? Would you like to try it? In any event, let me read it for you. So, thank you for this fantastic talk. I am very moved by your interpretation of reason as aspirational and the way you characterize the role of intellectual intuition in reason. I have 2 questions. One is to understand the relation between desire and aspiration in your characterization. Second is how, as agents, if we are self-determining through reason as aspirational, both aspiration and practical reason establish oughts and imperatives. How do we understand the hierarchy here, and how do we understand the hierarchy here, and how can we possibly know the meaning of aesthetic ideas given their dearth of sensible intuition? If this is the word is dearth, if you have other interpretations. Yeah, how can we possibly understand the meaning of aesthetic ideas given their dearth of sensible intuitions?
Okay, those are fantastic questions also. So, desire. It's hard to get one's mind around Kant's understanding of desire, because we think of desire as a lack or a yearning for something in the first instance. But for Kant, desire is having a concept of something that one wants to bring about. So what I want to say is that aspiration is, in a way, the highest, most extreme, most paradigmatic, something like that, version of desire, because in this case, we come up with these ends, objects to bring about an action entirely on our own, and we direct our activity accordingly. And that's what desire is. And in fact, insofar as we're directed sort of perpetually towards these objects, we are sort of at the height of desire in these cases. So that's kind of what I want to say. But I do think that there is this, as I said, in a more colloquial way, also a sense of sort of longing or yearning in Kantian reason. And I think that gets at sort of our meaning also of desire. I'm sure there's way more to be said here. Okay, and then oughts and imperatives and theoretical and practical reason. As I mentioned, I am struggling. I do feel that things work more naturally for me in the sphere of theoretical reason, and I also feel more comfortable in the sphere of theoretical reason myself. So I am struggling to think about how is it on my picture of Kant that practical reason has primacy, which of course Kant thinks that it does, and also that, as you're suggesting, which is not how it's really not a version of this issue that I was thinking of, but correct also, that practical reason provides oughts or imperatives in a way that theoretical reason does not. Theoretical reason gives us ideals. You could say, like, here's a nice thing. How about aiming at that? Here's something good, you could say, but it's not a command, theoretical reason, I think. So I guess and this was actually very similar, related to the desire question, I would say something like, although I'm not sure exactly how to work this out, but something like practical reason is sort of fully and through a matter of purposive action in a way that theoretical reason is not, because theoretical reason, of course, is also attempting to know about things that we're not creating, but rather exist independently. Whereas practical reason, the point is to make the things the good action, the good exist. So in that sense, I think of the practical reason as more paradigmatically what reason actually is about for Kant. Does that get you to oughts? I'm not sure. I have to think more about that, how it does. And sorry, aesthetic ideas and how do we understand them? So yes, here's another agenda I have. Yes, we should all recognize about, again, theoretical reason primarily, that Kant thinks we have only a very limited grasp on what these things mean. We kind of get it, but yeah. So I think, I have to figure this out more, but I think he does think that we take these concepts that do have meaning when they're used to organize sensible materials, and then we kind of cobble them together to make them into ideas. But that's very gestural about what their potential meaning is. So I'm very sympathetic with what you're asking there. I think that's a serious question in Kant, insufficiently recognized about how much reason is taking us beyond even our own understanding for him. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We feel like, as we discussed beforehand with Rachel, 10 more minutes. So I'd like to make use of them, if you allow me. So we have 2 questions on the chat, and I have one hand, Andrew's hand, but let me read the questions first because they were prior. So Tarkan has a question. You can read with me as well if you wish, Rachel. It's on the chat. So let me start with the first. Tarkan asks, does Kant claim and literally state intuition as a holy and godlike thing? Or is it that, like most people, we don't understand, comprehend what it is, and think that and call it as a holy, godlike thing?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, Kant does not say in paragraph 76 that this belongs to God. So the reason why I think that he is talking about the divine intellect and not just like, oh, it's so wonderful. The second option you suggest, oh, it's so amazing, so I'm going to call it divine. So I think this concept of, or idea of a being for whom everything would be thoroughly intelligible immediately, is very close in Kant's thinking to the other way he talks about God's intellect, and he really says it is God's intellect in that case, namely where God's representations of things just automatically make them exist. So there's just no gap for God, they're explicitly understood as God, between the conceptualization of the thing and its actuality. It's just by thinking of it, it exists. So I think now there are different aspects of this, and there's been debate about whether one can separate them. I think one can, but I think still for Kant, though they're not entailed by each other, they're very closely linked to one another. So it's not merely, as I say, the second option but that's a good question too.
Thank you. I have now Neslihan's question, one of our students. Let me read it. She asks, I think this is also relevant to the first two questions, but I think maybe helpful more. If intuitive intellect is merely a figure of contrast created by human reason upon becoming aware of its own finitude, then is our striving towards the transcendent, toward God, towards absolute knowledge or pure moral law, nothing more than a conscious illusion? Or conversely, could this very striving be the echo of a truth that does not originate within consciousness, but beyond it, perhaps a reflection of something in itself, such as the noumenal or the divine?
That also another wonderful question. Thank you. What can I say? So I think that the Kantian picture does always come close to this danger that these self-generated ends are just ends that we've in a way fictionally made up and set for ourselves, and what's so great about them. Another way of putting it is that and this is sort of where I ended the talk, and I do think this is where the pressure is. There's an immense amount of pressure on the view to say that from within reason, we can think through, just by thinking rationally, what the unconditional good is. And like the end, we have thought through rationally what the unconditional good is, and that is it. And there's nothing, and there's no like, this is a transcendent thing that guarantees that. There's no sort of truth to the reality that is beyond that. It's just, we have thought it through, what is good, and we have recognized that. The end. So that's a really high stakes view of what reason can accomplish. I don't think that would be illusory, but that would be saying, reason has really accomplished an amazing thing in doing that. So can we make good on that? I would like to, but no guarantees, I think.
Yeah. Kantian humility denies guarantees in many cases. I think this is one of those. That's the Kantian humility. So the last question, Andrew, please go ahead. I hope we can hear you. If you unmute yourself. Yeah, we need to, yes.
Thanks for the talk. It's been great. I will try to ask quickly. So the reason suggests to us this very admirable end, but it's not my natural end, and I'm never going to achieve it. I'm going to fall short. So I start to worry, just because the end is very admirable, it doesn't mean striving for it and failing for it is admirable, right? Someone might want to be a parent and they're not in a position where they could support a child. They maybe aren't emotionally mature enough to be a parent, and they say, but that was such an admirable goal, I'm going to go for it anyway. And it's worse because they're striving towards this goal and failing. So I'm just saying, I think this is an easy gap to, well, I don't know if it's an easy gap to fill, but at least there's a gap in the argument where you have to go from this goal is very admirable to the half fulfilled version of it is also admirable. Yeah, I'll be quiet so you can respond.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very nice formulation. I guess I do think that we can approximate, we can get closer to the goal. So it's not just trying and failing always, but trying and getting a little closer to it. So I do think, to take the first example, we're never going to have a theory that is fully verifiably absolutely true of like we're never going to have that scientific theory. But wouldn't it be better to have a theory that's more verified, like closer to that than what we currently, string theory or something which has no verification. So I think as a norm to approximate to, I think it's still worth it if we can't accomplish it. And I guess I would say the same about morality, that trying to become fully virtuous is good. If one becomes half virtuous, then that's better than none. That does run into the problem just textually that Kant thinks it is all or nothing virtue. But I guess this goes back to the earlier thing about like there's some things in Kant where I feel like no, it's really just us individuals doing this, and there is, like it's not all or nothing for us actually here. So, but so that's what I would say in the first instance. I do think, there could be an argument to be made about seeing the striving itself as somehow valuable, and the sort of constant progress beyond sort of complacent resting with where we are as itself valuable. I'm a little torn about that one, but I think that's in Kant's spirit also. So I guess that's what I would say on that. But it's, that's a Kantian question, right? Like that's the question. That's why Hegel and other people really hated Kant, because that's what Kant was asking us to do.
Yes.
Is constantly strive and constantly fail. So
Nothing is settled.
Right.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, thanks for all the questions and for all attendees. And Rachel, it was really, it has been a beautiful night for us, that we had some fresh air, we have some, peace of mind, and, engage in Kant, even in kind of, disconnection with earthly existing reality. So thank you so much, sincerely, for accepting our invitation and for the wonderful talk. We learned a lot as usual. We make use of your works as well. So thank you. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. And as I say, thanks for the wonderful questions. Really very helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So good night, everybody. So hope to meet you all again in another Türkiye Kant Society organization. Good night for us. Have a good day for you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Bye.